The handshake that destroyed a fortune lasted exactly 0 seconds because it never happened. Preston Whitfield looked at Dr. Evelyn Harper's extended hand and made the most expensive assumption of his life, dismissing the woman who controlled $10 billion as unworthy of basic human respect. In that Chicago boardroom, with November snow falling outside and bankruptcy papers waiting on his desk, he had no idea that his refusal to acknowledge her humanity would cost him everything his father had built and leave 150 employees wondering if prejudice was more powerful than second chances. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue. The November wind howled through downtown Chicago, rattling the windows of the 42nd floor, where Preston Whitfield adjusted his platinum cufflinks for the third time that Tuesday morning. His reflection in the polished marble wall showed a man who had never doubted his place in the world. 6 feet 2 inches of expensive suits and inherited confidence. His sandy brown hair perfectly styled, steel gray eyes that had never softened for anyone beneath his tax bracket. Preston's corner office overlooked Grant Park, where tiny figures moved like ants between the bare trees. His mahogany desk, larger than most people's bedrooms, held only 3 items. A crystal paperweight worth more than a teacher's yearly salary, a photo of his late father who'd built Whitfield Industries from nothing, and today's agenda. One meeting that would determine whether his company survived past Christmas. The Harper Industries representative should arrive within the hour, his assistant Carol announced from the doorway, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd fielded bankruptcy lawyers' calls all morning. The presentation materials are ready, and the legal team is standing by. Preston waved her away without looking up from his phone, where red numbers dominated his stock portfolio. 6 months ago, he'd been worth $200 million. Today, after a series of failed investments and a federal investigation into his offshore accounts, he was leveraged beyond recovery. Harper Industries represented his last lifeline, a potential $10 billion investment that could save everything he'd built. 3,000 miles away, Dr. Evelyn Harper sat in first class on American Airlines Flight 383, her fingers tracing the edges of a worn leather journal. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every dollar through brilliance rather than birthright. Her dark skin glowed against a crisp white blouse, her natural hair styled in a neat afro that framed high cheekbones and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. The journal contained 20 years of notes, investment strategies, company analyses, and personal reflections on the barriers she'd broken in boardrooms across America. Today's entry was brief. Whitfield Industries. Final assessment. Preston W. claims progressive values publicly. Let's see if his private character matches his press releases. Evelyn had built Harper Industries from a small consulting firm into a global investment powerhouse, specializing in identifying undervalued companies and transforming them through strategic capital and guidance. Her success rate was legendary on Wall Street, but what the financial press didn't know was her method. She always met potential partners in person, observing how they treated everyone from janitors to board members before making her decision. The flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Dr. Harper, we'll be landing in Chicago in 20 minutes. Thank you for choosing American Airlines." "Thank you, Jennifer," Evelyn replied, having noticed the woman's name tag earlier. "I hope your daughter's recital goes well tonight." Jennifer's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Few passengers remembered her name, let alone personal details she'd mentioned during beverage service. As the plane descended through gray November clouds toward O'Hare, Evelyn closed her journal and prepared for what would be the most important handshake of Preston Whitfield's life, though he had no idea that his future hung in the balance of a simple gesture of human respect. The brass elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower at exactly 2:15 p.m., revealing Dr. Evelyn Harper in her tailored navy blazer and matching skirt. Her black leather briefcase contained documents that could reshape Preston Whitfield's entire future, though the receptionist barely glanced up from her glossy magazine. "I'm here for the 2:30 meeting with Mr. Whitfield," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The blonde receptionist, whose nameplate read Brittany, finally looked up with the kind of smile reserved for people she assumed couldn't afford the marble floors beneath their feet. "Are you with the catering service? The meeting isn't for another 15 minutes, and we already have coffee set up." Evelyn's expression remained perfectly composed, though something flickered behind her eyes. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Harper from Harper Industries. We have a scheduled appointment." Brittany's smile faltered slightly as she scanned her computer screen. Oh my. I'm so sorry, Dr. Harper. Let me call Mr. Whitfield immediately." The apology felt hollow, rehearsed. Evelyn had heard variations of it in boardrooms from New York to Silicon Valley. She nodded graciously and took a seat in the waiting area, observing the office dynamics with the keen eye of someone who understood that how a company treated unexpected visitors revealed everything about its culture. Preston emerged from his office 5 minutes later, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. He'd expected someone different, someone who looked like the other billionaire investors he'd courted over champagne dinners at the Union League Club. His handshake preparation faltered for just a moment as he processed the elegant black woman rising from the cream-colored chair. "Dr. Harper," he said, recovering his practiced smile, "welcome to Whitfield Industries. I trust your flight from Los Angeles was comfortable." "Very much so. Thank you," Evelyn replied, extending her hand naturally, as she had thousands of times before in professional settings. Preston's eyes flickered to her outstretched hand, then to her face, then back to her hand. The pause lasted only seconds, but in that small eternity, 20 years of Evelyn's professional experiences crystallized into sharp focus. She'd seen this hesitation before, this moment when her race and gender intersected in ways that made powerful men uncomfortable. "I prefer not to shake hands with staff members," Preston said, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never questioned his own assumptions. "Nothing personal, just a company policy. Shall we proceed to the conference room?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. Evelyn's hand remained extended for another heartbeat before she slowly lowered it, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her face showed nothing, but inside, a familiar fire ignited. The same fire that had driven her through Harvard Business School when professors questioned her presence, through her first startup when investors wondered if she could really understand technology, through 2 decades of proving that excellence knew no color. "Of course," she said simply, her voice steady as bedrock. Preston turned toward the conference room, missing entirely the way Carol winced behind her desk, the way the junior associates exchanged glances, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He was already mentally rehearsing his presentation, calculating how quickly he could close this deal and solve his financial crisis. But Evelyn saw everything. She saw Carol's embarrassment, the way the young black intern by the copy machine looked down at his shoes, the subtle shift in energy that happens when dignity gets trampled in public. She'd built her fortune on reading these moments, understanding the character of potential partners through their unguarded actions. As they walked toward the conference room, Preston's internal monologue buzzed with relief and strategy. The Harper Industries representative seemed professional enough, though he wondered why they'd sent someone from their diversity department instead of a real decision-maker. No matter. He had charts showing projected returns, market analyses, and a compelling narrative about Whitfield Industries' potential for growth. Numbers didn't lie, and money talked louder than whatever sensitivity training his HR department kept recommending. Evelyn's thoughts moved in different directions entirely. She was calculating not just financial projections, but human costs. How many employees had endured similar treatment? How many qualified candidates had been overlooked? How many partnerships had this man's prejudices already torpedoed without his awareness? The conference room featured a long glass table surrounded by ergonomic chairs, each positioned to showcase the Chicago skyline beyond. Preston gestured toward a chair halfway down the table, the kind of seat typically reserved for note-takers and assistants, while he moved toward the head position that announced his authority. "Coffee? Water?" he offered, his tone suggesting someone fulfilling an obligation rather than extending genuine hospitality. Water would be fine, Evelyn replied, settling into the offered chair with the grace of someone who'd learned to find power in any position. Preston pressed the intercom button. Carol, could you bring some water for our guest? And maybe some of those cookies from the executive kitchen? The word guest carried particular weight, as if Evelyn were a visitor rather than someone whose decision could determine his company's survival. She opened her briefcase methodically, withdrawing a leather portfolio that contained documents Preston couldn't imagine. Financial statements showing liquid assets exceeding most nations' GDP. Investment histories that had created industries and toppled others. Letters of recommendation from 3 former presidents and the current Secretary of Commerce. I've reviewed your company's financial statements, Evelyn began, her voice carrying no trace of the insult she'd just absorbed. Quite impressive growth trajectory over the past decade. Preston's chest swelled with pride. Thank you. My father always said that success comes from knowing when to take calculated risks. We've invested heavily in emerging markets, particularly in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. What he didn't mention were the investigations, the leverage positions, the desperate borrowing against assets that were worth half their paper value. What he couldn't know was that Evelyn had spent the previous week conducting her own financial audit through connections that reached into every major bank and investment firm in America. Carol entered quietly with a crystal water glass and a plate of expensive imported cookies, setting them down beside Evelyn with the apologetic smile that spoke volumes about her own discomfort with her boss's behavior. Thank you, Carol, Evelyn said warmly, making brief eye contact that acknowledged their shared understanding of the situation's awkwardness. Preston had already launched into his presentation, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him. His laser pointer danced across projected charts, showing optimistic growth curves, market penetration strategies, and profit margins that existed more in hope than reality. Our 5-year projection shows a conservative estimate of 300% return on investment, he continued, his confidence building with each slide. Of course, this assumes continued expansion into markets where American companies maintain competitive advantages. Evelyn listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar pitches from desperate executives across multiple continents. She took notes in precise handwriting, asking occasional questions that demonstrated both her financial acumen and her awareness of details Preston hoped she would notice. Your debt-to-equity ratio has increased significantly over the past 18 months, she observed during a pause in his presentation. How do you plan to service existing obligations while funding expansion? The question pierced through Preston's carefully constructed narrative like a blade through silk. His throat tightened as he realized this wasn't going to be the easy sale he'd anticipated. Whoever Harper Industries had sent clearly understood financial analysis at a sophisticated level. We're exploring several refinancing options, he replied, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty. Strategic partnerships like the one we're discussing today provide the capital structure flexibility we need for optimal growth. Translation: we're drowning and need your money to survive. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully, making another note. Outside the conference room windows, November afternoon shadows lengthened across Grant Park, and somewhere in the building's depths, Preston's future was being decided by factors he couldn't yet comprehend. The handshake that hadn't happened would cost him everything. Preston clicked to his final PowerPoint slide with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. The projection showed a golden pyramid of projected profits, each level representing millions in potential returns. His confidence had returned during the presentation, fed by numbers that looked impressive when stripped of context and polished with optimistic assumptions. As you can see, Harper Industries would be getting in on the ground floor of what we project to be the most significant growth opportunity in our sector, he concluded, setting down his laser pointer with satisfaction. I believe your Diversity Investment Committee will find these returns quite compelling. Evelyn's pen paused mid-sentence on her notepad. Diversity Investment Committee? Well, yes, Preston said, loosening his tie slightly as he settled back into his chair. I assume that's the department you represent. Harper Industries has quite a reputation for supporting minority-owned businesses and social impact investing. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the conference room's glass walls. Evelyn set down her pen with deliberate precision, her movements controlled in the way that people who've mastered their emotions learn to manage moments of profound insult. "I see," she said quietly. Preston missed the danger entirely. In his mind, he delivered a masterful presentation to someone whose job was probably to evaluate companies for their social responsibility scores rather than their actual business potential. The hard financial decisions would be made by Harper Industries' real executives, people who looked like him and understood that business was about profit, not politics. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, warming to what he assumed was a shared understanding. "I completely support what Harper Industries is doing with their community outreach programs. It's smart business to have good public relations, especially in today's climate. But I think you'll agree that at the end of the day, numbers don't lie." Evelyn's internal response was a symphony of controlled fury, disappointment, and strategic calculation. She'd encountered Preston's type before. Men who assumed her success was somehow illegitimate, that her presence in elite business circles was the result of quotas rather than qualifications. What made this moment particularly galling was his casual assumption that she was some kind of middle management diversity officer rather than the person who would decide his company's fate. But Evelyn had learned long ago that emotional reactions were luxuries she couldn't afford in rooms like this. Instead, she channeled her anger into assessment, studying Preston with the cold precision of a surgeon examining a patient. His body language screamed desperation despite his confident words. The way he kept glancing at his phone suggested mounting pressure from creditors. The slight tremor in his hands when he'd reached for his water glass indicated stress levels that no amount of bravado could mask. "The numbers are indeed compelling," she replied, her voice betraying nothing. "Though I notice some interesting discrepancies between your projected cash flows and your current debt obligations." Preston's stomach clenched. How could someone from a diversity committee understand complex financial analysis well enough to spot the creative accounting his CFO had employed to make their situation look less desperate? "Every growing company faces cash flow challenges during expansion phases," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "That's precisely why strategic partnerships are so valuable. I'm sure your supervisors at Harper Industries understand that building market share requires accepting short-term liquidity constraints." There was again the assumption that she answered to supervisors, that she was someone's employee rather than someone's equal. Evelyn had built Harper Industries from nothing, turning a small consulting firm into a global investment powerhouse through 2 decades of 16-hour days and strategic brilliance. She'd advised 3 presidential administrations on economic policy, served on the boards of Fortune 500 companies, and managed investment portfolios larger than some countries' GDP. Yet here sat Preston Whitfield, a man whose inherited company was circling the bankruptcy drain, assuming she was a functionary sent to evaluate his company's diversity metrics. "My supervisors," she repeated slowly, tasting the irony. "Look, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here," Preston said, leaning forward with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing insider knowledge. "But between you and me, I think Harper Industries will be making a smart move investing in Whitfield. We're not some startup run by college kids with big dreams and no business experience. We're an established company with proven leadership and solid market fundamentals." Evelyn recognized the subtext immediately. Preston was distinguishing his company from the young, minority-owned startups that he assumed comprised Harper Industries' typical investment portfolio. In his worldview, companies led by people who looked like her were risky bets driven by social consciousness rather than sound business principles. "Proven leadership," she mused, making another note. Preston interpreted her response as engagement rather than evaluation. "Exactly. My father built this company from nothing through hard work and smart decisions. I've spent my entire career learning the business from the ground up, understanding what it takes to compete at the highest levels." What he didn't mention was that his father had started with a substantial loan from his own wealthy father that Preston himself had never worked anywhere else, and that his idea of learning the business from the ground up involved summers at country clubs networking with potential clients rather than actually understanding operations. Evelyn's phone buzzed softly with a text message. She glanced at the screen to see a message from her CFO. Whitfield's credit rating just dropped another notch. Bank of America called in their line of credit this morning. They've got maybe 6 weeks before forced liquidation. The information confirmed what her financial analysis had already suggested. Whitfield Industries wasn't seeking investment for growth. They were seeking a lifeline to avoid immediate bankruptcy. Preston's entire presentation had been an elaborate fiction designed to mask his company's desperate situation. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, closing her portfolio, "I appreciate the time you've taken to present your company's position. However, I think there may be some misunderstandings about the nature of this meeting." Preston's pulse quickened. Was she about to end the meeting? Had he somehow failed to communicate Whitfield Industries' value proposition effectively? "I'm not sure I understand," he said, his practiced smile wavering slightly. "You seem to believe that I'm here as some kind of preliminary assessor, someone who will report back to decision-makers at Harper Industries." "Well, aren't you?" Preston asked, confusion creeping into his voice. Evelyn stood slowly, her movements carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of world leaders and corporate titans. "Mr. Whitfield, I think we need to clarify exactly who you're speaking with." Preston remained seated, looking up at her with growing unease. Something in her posture, in the sudden shift of energy in the room, suggested that his assumptions about this meeting had been fundamentally wrong. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Harper," she said simply, "founder and CEO of Harper Industries." The words hit Preston like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, dawning horror. The woman he'd refused to shake hands with, the person he'd assumed was a diversity coordinator, the individual he'd been patronizing for the past hour, controlled a $10 billion investment fund. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as the implications crashed over him. Every condescending comment, every assumption, every casual dismissal suddenly took on catastrophic significance. He'd spent the last hour insulting the one person who could save his company, and he'd done it with the confident ignorance of someone who'd never questioned his own prejudices. "Dr. Harper," he stammered, rising from his chair so quickly that he knocked over his water glass. I had no idea." Evelyn watched the water spread across his presentation materials, soaking through charts and projections that suddenly seemed as worthless as the man who'd created them. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't." The spilled water created a moment of painful silence as Preston frantically grabbed napkins from the conference room sideboard, his hands shaking as he tried to salvage his presentation materials. The irony wasn't lost on Evelyn that he was now desperately trying to clean up a mess, both literal and metaphorical, that his own actions had created. "Please, Dr. Harper, let me get fresh copies," Preston said, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there minutes before. "I can have Carol print everything again in just a few minutes." Evelyn remained standing, her briefcase in hand, giving every indication that she was preparing to leave. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Whitfield. I believe I have all the information I need." The words sent ice through Preston's veins. He could hear the death knell of his company in her measured tone, could visualize the bankruptcy lawyers who would be calling within days if she walked out that door. 20 years of his life, his father's legacy, hundreds of employees who depended on Whitfield Industries for their livelihoods, all of it hanging by a thread that he'd nearly severed with his own prejudice. "Dr. Harper, please," he said, abandoning the soggy papers and moving toward her with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. "I realize there's been a tremendous misunderstanding. Could we perhaps start over?" Evelyn paused at the conference room door, her hand resting on the chrome handle. "Start over, Mr. Whitfield?" "Yes, exactly. I clearly didn't handle our introduction properly. I was distracted by other business pressures, and I'm afraid my usual professionalism slipped." Preston's words tumbled out in a rush, each sentence a small betrayal of the dignity he'd spent his life cultivating. If you could give me another chance to present Whitfield Industries properly. Before Evelyn could respond, Carol's voice crackled through the intercom with barely concealed panic. Mr. Whitfield, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have an urgent call on line 3. It's Mr. Goldman from First National Bank. Preston's face went ashen. Goldman was the senior loan officer who'd been managing Whitfield Industries' increasingly precarious credit situation. A call at this hour, on this day, could only mean one thing. The bank was calling in their loans. Tell him I'll call back in 30 minutes, Preston said, his voice tight with strain. Sir, he says it's extremely urgent. Something about collateral requirements and immediate action. Evelyn watched this exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a chess match where the outcome was already determined. She could see Preston's entire world collapsing in real time, could practically hear the dominoes falling one by one. Take a message, Preston said firmly, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. I'm in an important meeting. Carol's silence spoke volumes. In the 15 years she'd worked for Preston, she'd never heard such desperation in his voice. She knew about the mounting debts, the failed investments, the way her boss had been staying later and later each night, staring at financial reports that seemed to worsen with each passing day. Very well, sir, she replied quietly. Preston turned back to Evelyn with a smile that looked more like a grimace. I apologize for the interruption. Banking relationships require constant attention, as I'm sure you understand. Evelyn slowly moved her hand away from the door handle, not because she was inclined to give Preston another chance, but because she was curious to see how deep his desperation ran, how far he would go to secure the investment he needed. Sometimes the most revealing moments came when people had nothing left to lose. Mr. Whitfield, she said, returning to her chair, before we continue, I think we need to address what happened earlier. Preston's relief at her willingness to stay was palpable. He practically lunged back to his own chair, eager to demonstrate his renewed cooperation. Of course, absolutely. What would you like to discuss? You refused to shake my hand. The directness of her statement caught him off guard. He'd hoped they could simply move past that awkward moment without explicitly acknowledging it. In his world, uncomfortable truths were usually buried under layers of polite euphemism and strategic forgetting. Dr. Harper, I want you to know that had nothing to do with. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't make the situation worse. I have a general policy about physical contact in professional settings. It's not personal. Is that policy written down somewhere? In your employee handbook, perhaps? Preston's throat felt dry as dust. It's more of an informal guideline. I see. And does this informal guideline apply to all staff members equally? The questions were coming like precision strikes, each one designed to expose the hollowness of his excuses. Preston realized he was trapped in a logic maze of his own making, where every answer would only dig him deeper into the hole he'd created. Dr. Harper, I think we may be focusing on the wrong things here, he said, attempting to redirect the conversation. The real question is whether Harper Industries sees value in partnering with a company like Whitfield Industries. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, I think we're focusing on exactly the right things. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered it. Evelyn Harper. Preston could only hear one side of the conversation, but what he heard made his blood pressure spike even higher. Yes, I'm still in Chicago. No, the meeting is ongoing. You what? When? I see. Have Jennifer prepare the withdrawal paperwork, just in case. No, I haven't made a final decision yet, but I want us ready to move quickly if necessary. She hung up and looked directly at Preston, who was trying to appear calm, while internally screaming at the implications of what he'd just overheard. Withdrawal paperwork, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitfield, my team does thorough background research on all potential investment partners. We've discovered some interesting information about Whitfield Industries' financial position that wasn't included in your presentation. Preston's palms were sweating now. What kind of information? Your company is approximately 6 weeks away from forced bankruptcy. Your debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic. 3 major creditors have already initiated collection proceedings. The Bank of America line of credit you've been using to meet payroll was frozen this morning. Each fact landed like a physical blow. Preston had thought he was negotiating from a position of strength, presenting his company as a growth opportunity. Instead, he was begging for scraps from someone who already knew every detail of his desperate situation. Dr. Harper, yes, we're facing some short-term liquidity challenges, but that's exactly why partnerships like this are so valuable. Strategic capital injection can transform temporary setbacks into long-term advantages. Mr. Whitfield, you owe $47 million to creditors who are no longer willing to wait for payment. Your revenue has declined 30% over the past 18 months. Your largest client terminated their contract last week. These aren't temporary setbacks. They're fundamental business failures. The conference room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in around Preston like a trap. He was completely exposed, his carefully constructed facade stripped away by someone who understood his situation better than he'd realized anyone could. "How do you know all this?" he asked weakly. "Because it's my job to know," Evelyn replied simply. Harper Industries doesn't invest based on PowerPoint presentations and hopeful projections. We invest based on thorough analysis of financial reality, market position, and leadership quality. Preston's intercom crackled again. "Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Goldman is calling back. He says if you don't speak with him in the next 10 minutes, the bank will be forced to take immediate action regarding your accounts." The noose was tightening from all directions. Preston looked across the table at Evelyn, realizing that she held not just his future in her hands, but the future of everyone who worked for Whitfield Industries. Carol's mortgage, the janitor's kids' college funds, the 150 families who depended on the company for their livelihoods. "Dr. Harper," he said quietly, "what would it take for Harper Industries to consider investing in Whitfield?" It was the first honest question he'd asked all day. Evelyn studied Preston's face for a long moment, watching the desperation war with his remaining pride. She'd seen this expression before, on other executives who'd built their careers on assumptions about who belonged in boardrooms and who didn't. But there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of genuine fear that went beyond financial ruin. "That's an interesting question, Mr. Whitfield," she said, settling back into her chair. "But before I answer it, I'd like you to answer one for me. Tell me about your employees." Preston blinked, caught off guard by the shift in direction. "My employees?" "Yes. How many people work for Whitfield Industries? What are their names? What do they do?" "We have approximately 150 full-time employees across various departments," Preston recited, falling back on the kind of corporate speak that had served him well in board meetings. "Operations, sales, marketing, administrative support, facilities management." "I didn't ask for a departmental breakdown," Evelyn said quietly. "I asked about the people." Preston's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to understand what she wanted. In 20 years of running the company, he prided himself on maintaining appropriate professional distance from staff. He knew the department heads, of course, and had passing familiarity with senior managers. But the idea of knowing individual employees personally had always struck him as unnecessary micromanagement. "I'm not sure I understand what you're looking for," he admitted. Evelyn opened her briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder. "Let me tell you about some of your employees, Mr. Whitfield. Carol Williams has worked for your company for 15 years. She's been your assistant for the past 8. She has 2 daughters in college and a mother in assisted living who requires specialized care for Alzheimer's disease. Carol works overtime every week without additional compensation because she believes in the company's mission." Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd never thought to ask Carol about her personal life beyond the basic pleasantries required for professional interaction. "Jerome Washington works in your mailroom," Evelyn continued. "He's 23 years old and saving money to attend law school at Northwestern. He takes night classes 3 times a week and still arrives at Whitfield Industries every morning at 7 a.m. to sort mail and handle deliveries. His supervisor says he's the most reliable employee they've ever had." "How do you know all this?" Preston asked, though the question came out more defensive than curious. "Because I spent yesterday afternoon speaking with your employees," Evelyn replied. I visited the break rooms, the mail room, the custodial offices. I spoke with people who've been working for your company for years, people who've never been invited to a company meeting or asked for their input on business decisions. Preston's stomach churned as he realized the implications. You spoke with our staff without authorization? I introduced myself as a potential business partner conducting due diligence. Every conversation was voluntary. Evelyn's voice carried a slight edge now. Would you like to know what they told me? Before Preston could answer, she continued. Maria Gonzalez in accounting mentioned that she's been working unpaid overtime for 3 months because the department is understaffed. She's afraid to complain because she knows the company is struggling and she can't afford to lose her job. Her husband was injured in a construction accident last year, and their health insurance through Whitfield Industries is the only thing keeping their family afloat. Each revelation hit Preston like a physical blow. These weren't abstract statistics. They were real people whose lives he'd never bothered to understand, despite being responsible for their livelihoods. Timothy Chun in IT told me about the software upgrades he's been requesting for 2 years. Evelyn continued relentlessly. Equipment that would improve efficiency and protect company data. He's been making do with outdated systems held together by determination and creativity. When I asked him why he stayed despite better offers from tech companies, he said he believed Whitfield Industries was a good company that just needed better leadership. Preston's hands are trembling now. Dr. Harper, I appreciate your thorough research, but I'm not sure how employee testimonials relate to investment decisions. Don't you? Evelyn's voice carried 20 years of hard-earned wisdom. Let me tell you a story, Mr. Whitfield. 22 years ago, I was a junior analyst at a small consulting firm in Detroit. The company was struggling, and the owner was looking for a buyer. A wealthy investor came in, someone who reminded me very much of you. She paused, her gaze distant as memory took hold. He walked through our offices like he was touring a factory, looking at employees like we were equipment to be evaluated. When he met with staff, he didn't shake hands with anyone who didn't wear a suit. The administrative assistants, the custodial staff, the junior analysts like me, we weren't worth acknowledging as human beings. Preston felt heat rising in his cheeks as he recognized the parallel. That investor bought the company and fired 40% of the staff within 6 months. He kept the profitable clients and eliminated anyone he considered non-essential. The company survived, technically, but it lost its soul. It lost the people who'd made it special, who'd built relationships with clients, who'd understood the business from the ground up. Evelyn's voice grew stronger, more personal. I was one of the people he fired, not because I wasn't qualified, not because my work wasn't excellent, but because I didn't fit his image of what a successful consultant should look like. I was a young black woman in a field dominated by older white men, and he couldn't see past his own assumptions long enough to recognize my potential. The conference room fell silent, except for the distant hum of Chicago traffic 42 floors below. Preston found himself unable to meet Evelyn's gaze, suddenly seeing his own behavior reflected back at him through her experience. Being fired was the best thing that ever happened to me, Evelyn continued. It forced me to start my own company, to build something based on different values. Harper Industries has thrived because we understand that a company's greatest asset isn't its equipment or its intellectual property. It's the people who show up every day believing they're part of something meaningful. Preston's intercom crackled again, but this time he ignored it completely. Dr. Harper, I'm beginning to understand that I've made some serious mistakes today. Today. Evelyn's eyebrow arched slightly. Mr. Whitfield, this isn't about one bad day. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been building for years. Your employee turnover rate is 30% higher than industry average. Your customer satisfaction scores have been declining steadily. Your own department heads described you as distant and difficult to approach in their quarterly reviews. Preston's face went pale. You've seen our internal reviews? Public records, Mr. Whitfield. Discrimination lawsuits, wrongful termination settlements, EOC complaints. Your company has paid out over $2 million in legal settlements over the past 5 years. That's not the sign of an organization with strong leadership. The weight of Evelyn's research was crushing. Preston had always prided himself on running a clean operation, but he never connected the dots between his personal management style and the legal problems that had plagued Whitfield Industries. In his mind, lawsuits were just the cost of doing business in a litigious society, not symptoms of deeper cultural problems. "One more story," Evelyn said, opening another folder. "6 months ago, your company hired a brilliant young engineer named Kevin Thompson. Fresh out of MIT, top of his class, incredible recommendations. He lasted exactly 3 weeks." Preston vaguely remembered the name. If I recall correctly, Mr. Thompson decided that Whitfield Industries wasn't a good cultural fit. Whitfield Industries wasn't a good cultural fit. "That's one way to put it," Evelyn replied. "Kevin Thompson is my nephew, Mr. Whitfield. He told me about his experience working here, about the way you introduced him to clients as one of our diversity hires, about the way you questioned whether he'd really earned his MIT degree or benefited from affirmative action, about the day you suggested he might be more comfortable working for a company that specialized in urban markets." The revelation hit Preston like a thunderbolt. He'd been under investigation by Harper Industries for months without knowing it, his every action scrutinized by someone with the power to destroy him completely. "Kevin could have filed a discrimination lawsuit," Evelyn continued. "Instead, he took a position with Google and advised me to stay away from Whitfield Industries. But I wanted to see for myself what kind of man would treat a brilliant young engineer that way." Preston's world was spinning out of control. Every word he'd spoken, every assumption he'd made, every casual prejudice he displayed had been a test he'd failed spectacularly. "Dr. Harper," he whispered, "I had no idea." "No," she agreed sadly. "You didn't. And that's exactly the problem." The silence that followed Evelyn's revelation stretched between them like a chasm that 20 years of Preston's assumptions had carved. He sat motionless in his chair, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The manicured nails, the expensive watch, the platinum wedding band that had belonged to his grandfather, all symbols of a privilege he'd never questioned, never examined, never recognized as barriers between himself and the people whose lives he controlled. "Dr. Harper," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to fix this." It was the first completely honest statement he'd made all day, and Evelyn heard something in his tone that she hadn't expected, genuine remorse rather than strategic calculation. She'd seen enough desperate executives to recognize the difference between someone trying to save their company and someone beginning to understand the human cost of their failures. "Tell me about your father," she said quietly. Preston looked up, startled by the shift in direction. "My father. You mentioned he built this company from nothing. What was he like?" Preston's eyes moved to the framed photograph on the conference room sideboard. Robert Whitfield at the company's 10th anniversary celebration, surrounded by employees whose faces glowed with genuine affection and respect. The contrast with the current atmosphere at Whitfield Industries couldn't have been more stark. "He was everything I'm not," Preston admitted, the words coming out like a confession. "Dad knew every employee by name. He remembered their birthdays, their children's names, their personal struggles. When Maria Gonzalez started working here 12 years ago, he personally drove her to the hospital when her daughter broke her arm and she didn't have a car." Evelyn listened without interruption, watching Preston's face soften as memory took hold. "He used to say that business was just people helping people solve problems," Preston continued. "Every Christmas, he'd work a shift in every department, mailroom, custodial, cafeteria, because he wanted to understand what everyone did to make the company work. The employees loved him." "What changed?" Evelyn asked gently. Preston was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass table surface. "When Dad died 8 years ago, I was so afraid of failing that I overcompensated. I thought being distant made me look strong. I thought keeping professional boundaries made me appear competent. I was trying so hard to prove I deserved to inherit his legacy that I forgot what made that legacy worth inheriting." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Evelyn recognized the pattern. A son trying to fill his father's shoes by becoming everything his father wasn't, mistaking coldness for strength and isolation for leadership. "There's something else," Preston said, his voice growing even quieter. My father started this company because he'd been fired from 3 different jobs for standing up to racist supervisors. This was the 1970s, and he'd seen how brilliant employees were overlooked because of their background or appearance. He swore that Whitfield Industries would be different. Evelyn felt a shift in her chest, a crack in the wall of judgment she'd built around Preston. He was fighting the same battles I was. Yes, Preston said, finally meeting her eyes. And I've spent 8 years destroying everything you built. Not just financially, but morally. I became exactly the kind of person he fought against. The conference room door opened quietly, and Carol appeared with a fresh pot of coffee and 2 cups. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to read the emotional temperature of a room, setting down the service without interrupting the conversation. "Carol," Preston said softly, "I owe you an apology." Carol paused, clearly not expecting this development. "Sir." 8 years, Preston continued, his voice gaining strength. 8 years you've been covering for my mistakes, working unpaid overtime, managing my schedule around my bad moods and poor decisions. You've protected this company from my worst impulses, and I've never once thanked you properly." Carol's eyes filled with tears. In all her years at Whitfield Industries, she'd never heard Preston acknowledge her contributions beyond the perfunctory phrases in annual reviews. "And your daughters," Preston added, "Emma and Sophie, right? Emma's studying engineering at DePaul, and Sophie's pre-med at University of Illinois. I should have known their names years ago." "You remember," Carol whispered. "I looked them up in your personnel file this morning," Preston admitted, "because Dr. Harper made me realize I didn't know anything about the people who make this company run. I'm ashamed that it took the threat of bankruptcy to wake me up to what my father understood instinctively." Evelyn watched this exchange with growing interest. She'd seen many executives try to charm their way out of crisis, but this felt different. Preston's vulnerability seemed genuine, his recognition of his failures authentic rather than calculated. "Carol," Preston continued, "would you mind asking Jerome from the mailroom to join us? And Maria from accounting? I have some conversations that are long overdue." Carol nodded and left quietly, her expression mixing surprise with cautious hope. "Dr. Harper," Preston said, turning back to face her, "I understand if Harper Industries can invest in Whitfield. I understand if my behavior today has disqualified us completely. But would you be willing to help me understand how to do better? Not for the company, not for the investment, but for the people who depend on this place for their livelihoods." The question caught Evelyn off guard. In 30 years of business dealings, she'd rarely encountered an executive willing to admit fundamental character flaws, let alone ask for guidance in addressing them. "What are you asking me, Mr. Whitfield?" "I'm asking you to teach me how to be the leader my father was, how to see people the way he saw them, how to build the kind of company culture that actually serves everyone who works here." Jerome Washington appeared in the doorway, his mailroom uniform freshly pressed, his expression curious and slightly apprehensive. At 23, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that respect was earned through consistency and character rather than title or position. "Jerome," Preston said, standing to greet him, "thank you for coming. I wanted to apologize for something. In 3 years of working here, I've never properly introduced myself or acknowledged the excellent work you do." Jerome glanced between Preston and Evelyn, clearly unsure what was happening. "Sir, I understand you're studying law at Northwestern," Preston continued. "That's incredible. What kind of law interests you?" "Civil rights law, sir," Jerome replied cautiously. "I want to help people who don't have strong voices in the system." Preston felt the words like a physical blow, recognizing how his own behavior had probably reinforced Jerome's belief that the system needed fixing. "That's important work. Has Whitfield Industries supported your education at all? Flexible scheduling, tuition assistance, mentoring?" "No, sir, but the health insurance has been helpful for my family." Maria Gonzalez appeared behind Jerome, her accounting badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible in professional settings, her dark eyes alert and intelligent. "Maria," Preston said, "I owe you a much bigger apology. I understand you've been working overtime without compensation because our department is understaffed. That's unacceptable, and it's my responsibility to fix it." Maria's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitfield, I don't want to make trouble." "You're not making trouble," Preston assured her. "You're pointing out a problem that I should have addressed months ago. How is your husband doing? I heard about his accident." The simple question, asked with genuine concern, seemed to unlock something in Maria's expression. "He's getting better. Thank you for asking. The physical therapy is helping, but it's been a difficult year." "I imagine it has," Preston said quietly. "We should talk about ways Whitfield Industries can better support employees dealing with family medical issues." Evelyn watched this transformation with fascination. Preston was exhibiting a capacity for growth that she'd rarely seen in executives his age. The question was whether this change was genuine or simply another performance designed to secure her investment. "Dr. Harper," Preston said, turning back to her while Jerome and Maria remained in the room, "these are the people who've kept Whitfield Industries running despite my failures. They deserve better leadership than I've provided. Whether you choose to invest or not, I want to do right by them." It was, Evelyn realized, exactly what her nephew Kevin had deserved 3 weeks into his employment. It was what every person in this building deserved every day. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, she began to wonder if Preston Whitfield might actually be capable of becoming the leader his company needed. "That," she said quietly, "is the first thing you've said today that sounds like your father's son." The moment felt suspended in amber, fragile and precious. Preston stood surrounded by employees he was finally beginning to see as human beings. Evelyn watched with cautious optimism, and for the first time in months, the conference room held something that resembled hope. Jerome shifted nervously by the door and used to being invited into executive conversations. Maria clutched her accounting files, still uncertain whether this newfound attention from her boss was genuine or temporary. Then Preston's phone rang. The harsh electronic buzz shattered the delicate atmosphere like a hammer through glass. Preston glanced at the screen, and his face went ashen. "Goldman from First National," he murmured to Evelyn, then looked apologetically at Jerome and Maria. "I'm sorry, I have to take this." "Mr. Goldman," Preston answered, his voice attempting confidence he didn't feel. "I appreciate your patience today. I was in an important meeting with potential investors." The voice on the other end was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear fragments. "No more extensions, collateral insufficient. Immediate action required." Preston's transformation was immediate and devastating. The vulnerable, growing man who'd been apologizing to his employees vanished, replaced by the arrogant executive who'd built his career on intimidation and inherited privilege. His posture straightened, his voice hardened, and his eyes took on the cold calculation that had defined his leadership for 8 years. "Now listen here, Goldman," Preston snapped, turning away from the group. "Whitfield Industries has been a valued client of First National for over 2 decades. My father built a relationship with your bank based on mutual respect and long-term thinking. I won't be threatened by some middle management loan officer who doesn't understand the bigger picture." Evelyn felt her heart sink as she watched Preston's mask slip back into place. The growth she'd witnessed moments before suddenly seemed as fragile as tissue paper, easily torn when real pressure was applied. "I don't care what your risk assessment department says," Preston continued, his voice rising. "I'm in active negotiations with Harper Industries for a $10 billion investment. This panic over temporary cash flow issues is exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that's destroying American business." Jerome and Maria exchanged uncomfortable glances. They'd seen this version of Preston many times before. The man who used volume and threats to mask insecurity, who name-dropped connections to avoid accountability. "Mr. Goldman, let me be very clear," Preston said, his tone dripping with condescension. "If First National forces Whitfield Industries into bankruptcy over what amounts to pocket change, I will personally ensure that every business publication in Chicago knows how your bank destroyed a historic company over $47 million. Do you really want that kind of negative publicity?" Evelyn closed her portfolio with deliberate precision. The sound was soft, but in the suddenly tense atmosphere, It carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Preston was so focused on his aggressive negotiations that he missed the subtle shift in the room's energy. Furthermore, Preston continued, I want to speak with your supervisor immediately. Someone with actual authority to make decisions about long-term client relationships, rather than someone who just follows computer algorithms. Preston, Evelyn said quietly. He held up one finger without turning around, a dismissive gesture that communicated more clearly than words that her concerns were secondary to his phone conversation. Yes, I'll hold, Preston said into the phone, then spun around with a smile that looked more like a grimace. Dr. Harper, I apologize for this interruption. Banking relationships require firm management sometimes. They respond to strength. The silence that greeted his explanation was deafening. Jerome stared at his shoes. Maria shifted nervously toward the door, and Evelyn's expression had returned to the professional neutrality she'd worn when first arriving at Whitfield Industries. Jerome, Maria, Evelyn said gently, thank you for joining us. Perhaps you should return to your work now. They fled gratefully, leaving Preston alone with the woman who held his company's future in her hands and the phone call that was destroying his last chance at salvation. Mr. Whitfield, Evelyn said, her voice carrying 20 years of disappointed expectations, I think I've seen enough. Dr. Harper, please understand that banking relationships are different from employee relationships, Preston said quickly, sensing disaster approaching. Sometimes you have to project strength to maintain respect. Project strength, Evelyn repeated slowly. Exactly. Goldman and his people only understand power. If I show weakness, they'll crush us completely. It's just business. Evelyn stood and began gathering her materials. Just business, Mr. Whitfield? Panic crept into Preston's voice as he realized the conversation with Goldman had somehow derailed his progress with Harper Industries. Dr. Harper, I know this looks bad, but you have to understand the pressure I'm under. The bank is trying to destroy 20 years of my family's work over temporary financial difficulties. Temporary, Evelyn said, her tone suggesting she found the word inadequate. Preston's phone was still connected to Goldman's hold music, a tinny rendition of classical music that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Let me call Goldman back later. Our conversation is more important. Is it? Evelyn asked. Because 30 seconds ago, you told a bank officer that this conversation with Harper Industries was worth $10 billion, as if my decision had already been made. As if I were some kind of prop in your negotiations rather than a person you need to convince. The accusation hit Preston like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on projecting strength to Goldman that he'd forgotten Evelyn was listening, forgotten that his treatment of one person revealed his character to everyone watching. That's not what I meant, Preston said weakly. Mr. Whitfield, you just spent 10 minutes showing genuine remorse for your past behavior. You apologized to employees you'd neglected, acknowledged mistakes you'd made, and asked for guidance in becoming a better leader. I was beginning to believe that change was possible. Preston's phone began ringing again. Goldman calling back, adding another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Then your bank called, Evelyn continued, and you immediately reverted to the same arrogant, dismissive behavior that created this crisis in the first place. You talked down to a professional doing his job, made threats you can't back up, and used our conversation as leverage in your negotiations. Dr. Harper, please, let me explain. Explain what? That your apologies were strategic rather than sincere? That your moment of vulnerability was just another manipulation technique? That the growth I thought I witnessed was actually just fear dressed up as introspection? Preston's phone rang again, and this time he let it go to voicemail. But the damage was done. In trying to project strength to Goldman, he'd revealed to Evelyn that his transformation was as fragile as morning frost, disappearing the moment real pressure was applied. Mr. Whitfield, Evelyn said, closing her briefcase with finality, I've built Harper Industries on the principle that character is revealed under pressure, not in comfortable moments. What I just witnessed tells me everything I need to know about your true leadership capacity. One phone call doesn't define who I am, Preston said desperately. Doesn't it? Evelyn moved toward the door. Because that phone call showed me that when you're stressed, when you feel threatened, when your back is against the wall, you become exactly the kind of person your father fought against. You become a bully who uses privilege and connections to intimidate people doing their jobs. Preston's world was crumbling in real time. Dr. Harper, please. Everything I said to Jerome and Maria was sincere. I really do want to change to be better. Wanting to change isn't enough, Mr. Whitfield. Change requires consistency, especially when it's difficult, especially when you're afraid. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. Your father built this company on the principle that how you treat people when you don't have to reveal who you really are. Today, you had to treat me with respect because you needed something from me. But you didn't have to treat Goldman with respect, so you showed him who you really are. I can be better, Preston whispered. Perhaps, Evelyn said sadly. But not today, and not with my money. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. Have you ever seen someone's true character revealed under pressure? What do you think it takes for real change to happen? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories about growth, redemption, and second chances. Preston stood alone in the conference room, staring at the door through which his last hope had just disappeared. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water at depth, broken only by the persistent buzzing of his phone as Goldman called back with what would certainly be the final ultimatum. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's November sky had darkened to the color of old steel, and the first snowflakes of the season began their slow descent past the 42nd floor. His reflection in the glass showed a man he barely recognized. The confident executive who'd started the day was gone, replaced by someone hollow-eyed and shaking. Preston sank into his chair and finally answered the phone. Goldman, he said quietly. Mr. Whitfield, I've been trying to reach you for the past hour. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Preston closed his eyes. Let me guess. You're calling in the loans. The bank's board met this afternoon. Given the deteriorating financial position of Whitfield Industries and the missed payments over the past 3 months, we have no choice but to demand immediate satisfaction of all outstanding obligations. You have 72 hours to bring your accounts current, or will be forced to begin seizure proceedings. 72 hours, Preston repeated numbly. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitfield. I know this isn't the outcome anyone wanted. The line went dead, leaving Preston alone with the mathematical certainty of his destruction. $47 million in 72 hours. Even if he liquidated every personal asset, sold his house, emptied his retirement accounts, he might raise $12 million. The shortfall was insurmountable. Carol appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. Mr. Whitfield, is everything all right? Preston looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in years. Carol Williams, who'd protected him from his own worst impulses, who'd worked unpaid overtime to keep his company afloat, who'd never once complained despite watching him make decision after decision that hurt the people she cared about. Carol, he said softly, I need you to call an all-hands meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Conference room A. An all-hands meeting? Sir, we've never. I know, but it's time. Preston's voice carried a strange calm that surprised them both. Also, please ask Jerome to stay after his shift today. And Maria, and anyone else who'd be willing to listen to what I have to say. Carol hesitated in the doorway. Mr. Whitfield, did the meeting with Harper Industries not go well? Preston was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. The easy response would be to blame external factors, the bank's unreasonable demands, Harper Industries' impossible standards, the unfair economic climate. But Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. Character is revealed under pressure. The meeting went exactly as I deserved, he said finally. Dr. Harper gave me a chance to prove I could be the leader this company needs, and I failed. Completely. Sir, Carol, in 8 years of working together, have I ever asked you about your daughters? The question caught her off guard. No, sir. Not really. Emma and Sophie. Emma's studying engineering at DePaul. Sophie's pre-med at University of Illinois. You must be incredibly proud. Carol's eyes filled with tears. I am. They're both brilliant girls. And I should have known that years ago. I should have known about your mother's Alzheimer's, about the overtime you've been working, about the way you've been covering for my mistakes. Preston stood and walked to the window, watching the snow fall more heavily now. I should have known all of it. Mr. Whitfield, my father would have known, Preston said quietly. Dad would have remembered their names, their grades, their hopes for the future. He would have found ways to help with tuition, with your mother's care, with all the things that matter to the people who make this place work. Carol stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Your father was a special man. And I'm not, Preston said simply. But maybe it's not too late to try to be. An hour later, Preston found himself in an unfamiliar part of the building, the employee break room on the third floor. He'd never been there before, despite 8 years of running the company. The space was smaller than he'd expected, with mismatched furniture and a bulletin board covered in photos of employee families, graduation announcements, and birthday celebrations. Jerome was sitting at a small table, textbooks spread around him as he worked on an assignment. He looked up in surprise as Preston entered. Mr. Whitfield, is everything okay? Actually, Jerome, I wanted to apologize. Not just for today, but for 3 years of failing to see you as anything more than the person who delivers mail. Jerome closed his textbook, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Sir, you're studying civil rights law because you want to help people who don't have strong voices in the system. That tells me you've experienced what it's like to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be treated as less than you are. Sometimes, Jerome admitted carefully, I've been one of the people making you feel that way, haven't I? The directness of the question seemed to surprise Jerome. Mr. Whitfield, I don't think this is a conversation we should. Jerome, this company is going to declare bankruptcy within the week. The bank is calling in our loans, and we don't have the money to pay them. You're going to lose your job through no fault of your own, and you deserve to know that it's because of my failures, not yours. Jerome's face went pale. Bankruptcy. Harper Industries was our last hope for investment capital. Dr. Harper is brilliant, successful, and everything this company needed to survive. I insulted her from the moment she walked through our doors, dismissed her as unimportant, and proved to her that I'm exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with other people's livelihoods. What are you going to do? Preston was quiet for a moment, considering the question that would define the rest of his life. I'm going to tell the truth. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to gather everyone who works here and explain exactly what happened. I'm going to take responsibility for my decisions, apologize for my failures, and help everyone find new positions before the bankruptcy proceedings begin. That's going to be hard, Jerome said quietly. Yes, it is, but it's what my father would have done. Maria appeared in the break room doorway, still carrying the accounting files from their earlier meeting. Jerome, Carol said you were... She stopped when she saw Preston. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Maria, please come in, Preston said. I owe you an apology too. Mr. Whitfield, you don't need to. I do actually. 3 months of unpaid overtime because I didn't hire adequate staff. A husband recovering from serious injury while you worry about whether you'll have health insurance next month. I should have been supporting you instead of taking your dedication for granted. Maria sank into a chair, the weight of uncertainty suddenly visible on her face. Are we really going to lose our jobs? Yes, Preston said honestly. But I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you land somewhere better. Somewhere with leadership that values what you bring to the table. The three of them sat in the break room as snow continued to fall outside the windows, and Preston realized that this conversation, honest, difficult, and overdue, felt more like leadership than anything he'd done in 8 years of running Whitfield Industries. His phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it expecting another crisis, but instead saw something that made his breath catch. The message was from an unknown number. Mr. Whitfield, this is Dr. Evelyn Harper. If you're serious about change, meet me at Millennium Park tomorrow at 7 a.m. Come alone. Preston stared at the message, hardly daring to hope. Then he looked at Jerome and Maria, 2 people whose lives he'd damaged through his arrogance and neglect, and realized that whatever Dr. Harper wanted to discuss, his first responsibility was to the people sitting in this break room. Jerome, Maria, he said quietly, whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting both of you today has been the most important part of my education as a leader. You deserve better from me, and you deserve better from whoever you work for next." It was the first completely honest thing Preston Whitfield had said in years. The November wind cut through Millennium Park like a blade, carrying the scent of Lake Michigan and the promise of winter's early arrival. At 6:45 a.m., the park was nearly empty except for a few dedicated joggers and a man in an expensive overcoat who stood beside the Crown Fountain, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Preston had barely slept, spending the night rehearsing apologies and preparing for what might be his final conversation with Dr. Evelyn Harper. He dressed carefully in his father's old Navy pea coat, abandoning the designer suits that had become his armor in favor of something that felt more authentic, more humble. At exactly 7 o'clock, Evelyn emerged from the morning mist wearing a deep red wool coat and carrying 2 cups of coffee from a nearby vendor. She handed one to Preston without ceremony, and they stood in silence for a moment, watching early commuters hurry past on their way to the loop. "Thank you for coming," Preston said finally. "I wasn't sure you would," Evelyn replied. "After yesterday, I expected you might be too proud to show up. Yesterday, I learned that my pride has been the most expensive luxury I've ever indulged in." Preston took a sip of coffee, grateful for the warmth. "Dr. Harper, I need to tell you something before we discuss anything else. I spent last night with my employees explaining what's going to happen to the company. Bankruptcy, job losses, the end of everything my father built." Evelyn studied his face carefully. "How did they react?" "With more grace than I deserved. Jerome offered to help with the transition planning. Maria stayed until midnight, helping me compile a list of employee skills and references for potential new employers. Carol volunteered to work without pay during the final weeks to ensure everyone gets their last paychecks." "And how did that make you feel?" Preston was quiet for a long moment, watching a flock of geese settle on the partially frozen lagoon. Ashamed, grateful, determined to be worthy of their loyalty, even if it's too late to save their jobs. "Mr. Whitfield, why do you think I asked you to meet me here?" "Honestly, I have no idea, but I'm hoping it's because you believe people can change, even when they've failed as badly as I have." Evelyn began walking slowly along the pathway that circled the park's central plaza. Preston fell in a step beside her, matching her measured pace as they moved past bare trees and empty benches. "Yesterday afternoon, after I left your office, I made several phone calls," Evelyn said. "I spoke with your bank, your major creditors, and 3 of your largest former clients." Preston's stomach tightened. "What did you learn?" "That Robert Whitfield's son has been making enemies faster than his father ever made friends. But I also learned something else. Every person I spoke with mentioned that in the past 6 months, something had been changing at Whitfield Industries. Employees seemed more engaged, customer service had improved, and there were fewer complaints about management behavior. 6 months ago, Preston said quietly, my father would have turned 75. I started thinking about the legacy I was building compared to the one he'd left me. The change was real then, not just yesterday's performance. The change was real, but it wasn't enough. And it wasn't fast enough. Preston stopped walking and turned to face her. "Dr. Harper, I need you to know that I'm not here asking for your investment. My company is finished, and that's my responsibility. I'm here because you offered to teach me how to be a better leader, and I need that lesson more than I need your money." Evelyn continued walking, but Preston caught something that might have been approval in her expression. "What do you think being a better leader means?" "I think it means seeing people before you see their utility. It means understanding that every decision affects real lives, real families, real dreams. It means being the kind of person others can trust with their hopes instead of the kind who crushes them through carelessness or prejudice." They'd reached the Lurie Garden, where dormant plants waited beneath protective coverings for spring's return. Evelyn paused beside a bench and finally turned to face Preston directly. "Mr. Whitfield, Harper Industries specializes in transformational investments. We don't just provide capital. We partner with leaders who have the potential to create lasting positive change. I understand, and I appreciate that someone of your caliber was willing to consider Whitfield Industries at all." "Preston," Evelyn said, using his first name for the first time, What if I told you that yesterday's failure was actually yesterday's test? Preston's breath caught. I don't understand. Yesterday, I watched you demonstrate genuine remorse, authentic vulnerability, and the beginning of real growth. Then I watched you revert to your worst impulses under pressure. That told me everything I needed to know about where you are in your development as a leader, that I'm not ready, that you're exactly where someone needs to be before they can learn to be great. Evelyn sat down on the bench and gestured for Preston to join her. Preston, your company is going to declare bankruptcy. That's unavoidable at this point. But bankruptcy doesn't have to mean the end of your story. Preston felt hope and confusion warring in his chest. What are you suggesting? Harper Industries is prepared to acquire Whitfield Industries' assets, retain all current employees, and offer you a position as Director of Operations under new management structure. The words hit Preston like a physical blow. You want to buy my company and offer me a job in it? I want to save 150 jobs and give a man who's finally ready to learn a chance to prove he can grow. Evelyn's voice carried both firmness and compassion. But there will be conditions. Name them. First, you would report to a new CEO, someone with experience in building inclusive company cultures. You would have operational responsibilities, but no authority over personnel decisions until you've demonstrated consistent growth. Preston nodded slowly. The arrangement would be professionally humiliating, but it would save the livelihoods of people who depended on the company. Second, you would undergo comprehensive leadership training, including coaching on unconscious bias, inclusive management practices, and emotional intelligence. This wouldn't be optional or cosmetic. It would be a core requirement of your employment. I understand. Third, and most importantly, you would be accountable to an employee advisory board that would have the authority to evaluate your progress and recommend your dismissal if you revert to previous patterns of behavior. The condition was unprecedented in Preston's experience, giving his former subordinates power over his professional future. It was also exactly what the situation required. Dr. Harper, Preston said quietly, those conditions sound fair and necessary. But I have to ask why you're willing to offer this opportunity to someone who insulted you, dismissed you, and proved himself unworthy of your trust. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, watching the sun break through the morning clouds and cast long shadows across the garden. Because 22 years ago, someone gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Because I believe that people can change, but only when they're forced to confront the full cost of their failures. And because your father's legacy is worth preserving, even if it means rebuilding it from the ground up. Preston felt tears he hadn't shed since his father's funeral began to burn behind his eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me in 5 years if you've become the leader your employees deserve. They sat in comfortable silence as Chicago awakened around them, the morning rush beginning to fill the streets with purpose and possibility. Preston thought about Jerome's law school ambitions, Maria's financial struggles, Carol's daughters, and their bright futures. For the first time in months, those futures seemed secure. Dr. Harper, Preston said finally, I have one more apology to make. To whom? To you. Not for yesterday's business mistakes, but for yesterday's personal ones. I treated you with disrespect because I made assumptions based on your appearance rather than your character. That was wrong, and it was inexcusable, and I'm sorry. Evelyn extended her hand toward him. Mr. Whitfield, I believe in second chances and new beginnings. This time, Preston took her hand immediately, holding it with the respect and gratitude of someone who finally understood that every human connection was a privilege rather than an obligation. 6 months later, Whitfield Industries had been renamed Heritage Solutions. The Employee Advisory Board had voted unanimously to expand Preston's responsibilities, and Jerome Washington had received a full scholarship to Northwestern Law School funded by the Harper Foundation. Love, it turned out, was sometimes about learning to see people as they truly were rather than as you expected them to be. What do you think it takes for someone to truly change? Share your story in the comments. Like this video if it moved you, and subscribe for more powerful stories about redemption, growth, and the unexpected ways we find love and respect in the most challenging moments. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, You'll surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.